Hello there. So, back to chapter 5 of the textbook. Um, I know in chapter 4 I talked about wanting to be able to discuss the results of the Iowa caucuses on the Democratic side. Who could have predicted all of the technical difficulties that they had? We still don't know who won Iowa on the Democratic side. Trump handily won the Republican caucuses, but we won't know the results for Iowa until starting tonight at 5, I believe, is when they're going to start releasing the results again. So, waiting a day for the results for Iowa did nothing because I can't wait another day to upload this chapter for you guys. But there's now at least some discussion about the effectiveness of caucuses versus primaries again, and whether or not the caucuses should be replaced with primaries in these states, because primaries are usually easier and more democratic than caucuses. But we'll move on from that. So, quiz is due Sunday for both Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Remember to do them on time. I'm going to be including the case for today, which includes 2 videos. Both of these videos have explicit language in them. They're both from Last Week Tonight, which is an HBO show. It's up to the instructor's discretion if they want to show these videos in class. The information from these videos will be on the test or up in the air for being on the test, so you do need to know the information from these. If you guys do watch them, I would like for you to have a discussion on it, both over the death penalty and the argument that the video makes is against the death penalty. The argument for the death penalty is pretty straightforward. So after you watch them, if you do watch them in class, have a quick little discussion about it, about the application of the death penalty and if it should be still used today. We'll get into the lecture here now. So, what are equal rights or civil rights? I believe your textbook calls it equal rights, but I think I'll try and call it civil rights in all the lecture material. So civil rights are rights that have to be given to the citizens and have to be given protection in order for them to not be taken away. A civil right is the right to vote. It is not a natural right like civil liberties are. It is a right that the government gives you, and it's the government's place to make sure that everyone is able to have equal civil rights. So the real question, especially in the majority of our history, is how equal is equal? We've had civil rights for, at least for parts of our populace since the inception of our country, but definitely not civil rights for everyone. And how does that spread across the populace of the United States? Here's a question that if you guys have some time, take about 5 minutes and discuss the key differences between civil rights and civil liberties, and come back to me when you guys are ready. So we'll get started on where we get the majority of our civil rights from. The 14th Amendment gives equal protection of all citizens under the law. And it forbids states from giving preferential treatment to certain citizens. This was in direct reaction to the treatment of African Americans, former slaves in the South, and trying to ensure that slavery did not return in the South by removing civil rights from African Americans and other minorities. A big part of this was segregation in schools from Plessy versus Ferguson, of separate but equal, and overturned by Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, making schools integrate. We see little segregation After that, little changes in segregation, I should say, not little segregation. Schools were slow to integrate, and there were still major differences between communities and their racial makeup. So the Supreme Court has encouraged busing as a solution. Early on in the Democratic primaries, busing became a big issue of Vice President Biden's support of busing and its impact on some African American and minority communities. And for the most part, it has mixed results depending on the community and how effective it was. Even to this day, we still see extremely segregated schools. White flight to the suburbs has increased this, where we have very wealthy schools compared to inner city schools that are more racially diverse but less funded because of the flight to the suburbs and removing of more wealthy members of the community that tax dollars could have gone to that school. So there's been several tests judicially for equal protection. We have the reasonable basis test, making a test to see if something is reasonably legitimate, trying to show that there is no inequality in the test or in the bill that's being passed. The strict scrutiny test presumes all laws unconstitutional, or presumes not all law. The law is unconstitutional unless the government can provide a compelling base for it. Basically, any sort of bill that is preferential to one race or the other needs to have a strict explanation for why it's taking place. This is where classification of people is used as a discrimination. There's also gender classifications. This is more of an intermediate classification and treatment of bill passage. So the relatedness of the minority group is highly important to the strict scrutiny test. That's basically what I'm saying here. So first major civil rights act during the civil rights movement is the Act of 1964, which provides equal access and protection in public accommodations. So public buildings, buses, public arenas, everyone should have equal access. And you get past small businesses, and any medium or large size firm cannot discriminate based on race, color, sex, and nation of origin or religion. What is not included here is sexual orientation. This is still being fought in the Supreme Court right now, of treating sexual orientation as sex discrimination under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We'll see how the Supreme Court rules on that soon. They probably will decide on that in the summer, possibly. There are still some lawful forms of discrimination. When I applied to jobs, I applied to some private religious institutions, and they are allowed to have preferential decisions when they come to hiring. You would have to declare your faith on the application, and they can use that to determine hiring. If I was, this is an example, if I was applying at a Catholic school, I would have to declare that I am not Catholic, and they could choose a candidate that is just as good as I am, but because they're Catholic in that selection process. So we had the Civil Rights Movement. We've talked about this a bit. This is what pushed the Civil Rights Act to getting passed and the Voting Rights Act. Started with the bus boycotts by MLK, and then the March on Washington. I didn't show in this class. The first day of class I showed Dr. King's speech at the March on Washington. That's the I Have a Dream speech. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. I highly suggest watching it and understanding that time period. There's still been a massive resistance to the Civil Rights Act after it was passed, and there's still fights against it in some states as it limits states' rights. But for the most part now, the Civil Rights Act is at least attempted to be used in all states. We had the women's rights movement as well. The start was for women's right to vote. First major meeting of this was in 1848. This was before the 15th Amendment was passed that gave the right to vote to men of color, but not women. Then the fight continued until the early 1900s when women were given the right to vote under the 19th Amendment. So now we tried to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which would guarantee equality of pay and other measures between men and women. It has still not been ratified because not enough states have ratified it to make it into law. So the Equal Pay Act attempted to make pay equality. Title IX in schools, you have to have programs for both boys and girls. Equal Credit Act, making banks treat men and women equally when they're trying to take out a loan. So we come to Hispanic Americans. First major movement towards more civil rights was the farm workers movement with Cesar Chavez. This led to strikes in the 60s and 70s with migrant workers. This allowed for collective bargaining by farm workers in California. Was successful in California, but didn't have nearly as success in states like Texas and Arizona. Native Americans have had deep struggles when it comes to civil rights, especially with the decline in population that occurred in early American history, where there was at least 5 million Native Americans, and that was reduced to 250,000 by 1900. Native Americans weren't even granted citizenship until 1924, and then we had the Indian Bill of Rights in 1968, which guaranteed rights on reservations. Native Americans have been able to increase the control over their own affairs from the federal government as well. We still have other protests that have occurred. The Trail of Broken Treaties protest, Wounded Knee in South Dakota. We've had other ones more recently over a pipeline as well there. So Asian Americans have had deep problems with American civil rights equality. Chinese and Japanese laborers, working on western states and railroads and mines, were treated close to slave labor. In 1892, we suspended all immigration from Asia. We had strict limits on Chinese immigrants as well prior to that. They weren't even finally lifted until 1965 when it came to Asian Americans coming in. We had internment camps for Japanese Americans during World War II, but not for German Americans, despite being the same argument. And Lau versus Nichols allowed for bilingual instruction in some schools in highly homogeneous area, such as in big cities, allowing for teaching in native languages as well as English. So in '65, we had the Voting Rights Act. Prior to that, the 15th Amendment allowed for voting rights for all African American men to vote. However, we had white primaries in the South and literacy tests and poll taxes to limit African Americans from voting. White primaries is basically when the Democratic Party in the South was the one party, when the Democratic Party was the Conservative Party. They had it to where African Americans couldn't vote in the Democratic primary, and then without a Republican candidate or a third-party candidate, even if African Americans could get past the poll taxes and literacy tests, then there was no one for them to vote for, because then they would be up against an ultra-conservative candidate that would have no one competing against them. So there was no reason for African Americans to feel like they should vote. White primaries were declared unconstitutional in the 40s. The 24th Amendment gets rid of poll taxes. And then after that, we banned literacy tests, moving towards allowing people free access to voting. It allowed for federal agents to oversee voting, especially in the South, to make sure the states weren't disenfranchising African Americans still. There's also been attempts to prevent race-based gerrymandering. This was weakened in Shelby County versus Holder, making it easier for mainly African American areas to be gerrymandered. So here is a distribution of voting for the Republican Party. You can see that not a lot of minorities consider themselves to be Republican. This is from your textbook, and even the majority of Republican voting is Southern whites still, because of the Civil Rights Act. And, well, the Civil Rights Act, we can go into why the parties flipped distributions. Basically, since Johnson was president, he was the one who brought in the Civil Rights Act. So when Goldwater ran in '68, from Arizona, he ran against the Civil Rights Act in order to pick up, Goldwater was running as a Republican, to pick up voters in the South. He lost northern voters because of it, northern Republicans, and picked up only a few southern Republican states. And because of that, the Republican Party became the party of the conservatives, and the party demographics swapped. So despite the Democratic Party formerly being the Conservative Party, it is now the Liberal Party. So '68, we had another Civil Rights Act. This was for housing discrimination. We had redlining, which is refusal of mortgages in certain neighborhoods. These neighborhoods happen to be for Latinos and African Americans. This pattern still exists today. While we removed redlining, there's still housing segregation that occurs. And it's still more difficult for African Americans and Hispanics to obtain a mortgage than white people with the same income. So here is the first clip. This is from Adam Runs Everything. Well, both clips for today are from that show. But it will go into a little more detail about redlining. Okay.
Hey, Adam here. If you
Okay, we don't need to listen to that. So, as you guys can see, there's still severe problems when it comes to housing inequality in the United States. which has a compounding factor on income inequality as well. So there were measures to help prevent these kind of discriminations called affirmative action. Affirmative action is just deliberate efforts in order to help disadvantaged groups when it comes to gathering resources, whether that be employment or education. It's most commonly discussed when it comes to education. This is usually when it comes to federal funding as well. If you have to abide by affirmative action if you're going to get federal funds. So there are many court cases that go into federal affirmative action. Here is a list of them. We won't go into all of them. Basically affirming federal aid when it comes to affirmative action. There are two kinds of discrimination that we're talking about here. We have de jure criminal or discrimination, which is these discrimination based on law that we've discussed, and then de facto discrimination, which is conditions where historically disadvantaged groups are discriminated against because they have fewer opportunities. Affirmative action is here to alleviate de facto discrimination and hopefully get an equality of result despite an inequality to start. That is the purpose of affirmative action. So there's still struggles to get equality in this country today, as we saw from the Adam Runs Everything video. There's been progress to make America more equal, but we still have deeply rooted problems when it comes to civil rights distribution. And when it comes to disadvantaged groups, there's still substantial inequality when it comes to daily lives. You can think about simple things. If you are making more money, you can buy in bulk easier. Buying in bulk is cheaper than buying a smaller package. And so having more upfront income allows you to save money in the long term. That is a compounding factor on everything when you look at accrued savings. And so it costs more to be poor. So when we talk about African Americans in the United States, I guess there's only African Americans in the United States. Continuing high disparity in income. There's severe differences in conviction on crimes and sentencing. African Americans are still more likely to get a longer sentence than white Americans for the same conviction. Higher incarceration rates by population. There is far more African Americans by population in prison than whites because of higher arrest rates and prejudices in the criminal justice system. There has been substantial progress when it comes to elected office, though. We've seen more than 500 black mayors in the United States. We have one current Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, is African American. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American before Clarence Thomas. We currently have 56 black members of the House and only 3 black senators. These 3 senators are Kamala Harris of California, Cory Booker of New Jersey, and Tim Scott of South Carolina. Both Kamala Harris and Cory Booker were running for president until recently dropping out of the race. And of course we had the 44th president of the United States, Barack Obama, being African American as well. So when it comes to the largest percentage of the population that has inequality, is women. This has a lot to do with job-related inequality issues, pay inequality, family leave and gender pay equality are continuing problems. It is difficult for women to work and have a child at the same time because of maternity leave being an issue. We've seen recently a feminization of poverty, as we see most single parent families are women, and being a single parent household is one of the biggest issues of having a family under the poverty line. Women have also seen successes politically. We have 3 justices on the Supreme Court. We have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, the first justice being Sandra Day O'Connor. So we've seen progress in that regard on the Supreme Court. We currently have 102 women in the House. That's the most in history. And we have 25 women in the Senate. I'm not going to list all 25 in the slides. And that's a good thing that we have 25% of the Senate is female. That is progress when it comes to representation. And we also had the first major party candidate to be president with Hillary Clinton in 2016. We can see that the United States is not great when it comes to equal representation of women in legislatures. Only 19% of our legislatures are female, compared to Sweden that has 44%. There are other countries that have higher gender quotas as well, but it's a discussion for another day. And we see that female-headed families, 32% of them are under the poverty line or living in poverty, versus male-headed families or 2-parent families. So Native Americans have had some of the most disturbing discriminations in American history, along with African Americans. There are currently more than 2 million Native Americans in the United States. Half of these individuals live on federal reservations, and they have treaties with the federal government that deals with relations between the tribes and the federal government. State governments have no direct authority over these reservations. It is directly connected with the federal government, which is why we have Department of Indian Affairs in the federal government. There's still problems with retention of native cultures and self-government in these reservations, as well as economic growth on reservations and around surrounding communities. There's still severe problems with gambling conflicts between tribes and state governments as well. They've seen some electoral success for Native Americans. There's currently only 4 members of the House that are Native American, with no senators currently Native American in the House and the Senate, and 4 historical senators over the entire history of the United States. Hispanic Americans are the largest growing demographic in the United States, and one of the longest ethnic groups historically in the United States, with being in Florida and New Mexico and other early states. It is still currently the fastest growing and largest minority group in the United States. It will become the majority in Texas soon. We still have immigration problems for Hispanics that lead to issues when it comes to treatment of Hispanics in our country. We have more than 4,000 Hispanic Americans holding public office right now, with 44 House members and 4 senators. Bob Menendez, gosh, I cannot speak, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and then Catherine Cortez Masto, with Sonia Sotomayor being our only Latinx Supreme Court justice. And a big problem when it comes to Hispanic representation is only about half of Hispanic Americans are registered to vote, making it more difficult for their voice to be heard and provide for more representation. and they have a growing political power in states like Texas, California, and Florida, who are the most populous states, minus New York. So Asian Americans, this is now numbering in 12 million Americans, mostly on the West Coast in California. They have upward mobility, unlike other minority groups for the most part. This is your textbook talking about this. We'll talk about the problems with this kind of information. The textbook says that they have family-based self-reliance and emphasis on education in their culture. They have highest rates of two-parent families as well, and have highest rate of median family income. So this boils down to this idea of the model minority myth, which is where we're going to watch our next video that discusses the model minority myth.
Boy, I'm sure glad we left the pool party, Trey. Math homework is way more fun.
Computer, that's the first thing you've ever said that doesn't add up.
You're so studious, Computer. Trey, you could learn a thing or two from his people. They're very wise.
Whoa! Time out! Here we go again. TV and movies are rampant with Asian stereotypes, especially the idea that Asian people are some kind of model minority. Smart, successful, polite, obedient, and of course, inherently good at math.
Gee, what's the big deal? Those are all compliments.
Well, these compliments actually originated in a government propaganda campaign, and not too long ago, white Americans actually thought the exact opposite.
Time in! In the mid-1800s, Americans were so hostile to Chinese people, the country passed laws banning Chinese immigration and denying their freedoms. They were stereotyped as a lazy, opium-addicted, menacing horde dubbed the Yellow Peril.
And your old Uncle Sammy didn't stop there.
Uncle Sandy!
Yeah, Uncle Sammy hasn't been such a cool uncle. Because of anti-Asian racism during World War II, the United States interned Japanese Americans in concentration camps.
Hey, it's our Japanese friend Kenji from up the street. Oh, that's not your friend. That's a spy. He wants to kill Americans.
Uncle Sammy, why didn't you do that to German Americans in World War II?
Yeah, I wonder.
Because
they're white.
But all that changed when the U.S. needed to suck up to its Asian allies during the Cold War. See, as the Soviet Union rose to power, the U.S. worried that Soviet propaganda was making communism sound dynamite.
America is so racist, am I right? It's like, hey, USA, cut it out.
Woof. Guess I better have mercy on these Asians.
So America embarked on a propaganda campaign to tout Asian American success stories. The State Department highlighted Asian American artists, politicians, and even sent an all-Chinese American basketball team on tour overseas.
Forget all that nastiness earlier. America loves our Asian sports heroes.
And in 1965, Congress approved a landmark immigration law that ditched racist restrictions. But it gave preference to immigrants who had training, talent, or skill sets that would benefit the U.S. economy.
Sammy and the Rippers are changing their tune. Borders now open for smart, successful Asian immigrants. Wow, now that I've let all these educated, successful Asians into America, I've got to say, Asian Americans sure are successful and educated.
So America went from a country that despised Asians to one that held them up as a shining example of assimilation. And this self-fulfilling prophecy resulted in the model minority myth.
And the most sinister part of this myth is it was used to put other minorities down, and it's still holding people back today.
Oh, it's our very special guest star, Professor of History at Indiana University, Ellen Wu.
Why did I need to use the ladder, Adam? Aren't we on the ground floor?
It's a sitcom thing.
In the 1960s, government officials looked at socioeconomic data from African American communities and contrasted it to the so-called family values and stability of Asian Americans. Now, this fueled racist claims that Black people had no one to blame but themselves if they experienced poverty and other social disadvantages. Conservatives went on to use these claims to justify making cuts to many essential social programs for African Americans and other disadvantaged minority groups.
They were even used to argue against civil rights.
Come on, you don't see Computer complaining about fair and equal protection. Asians earned their place in this country. Why can't you?
What? No, Uncle Sammy, you helped Asian people. Why can't you see that?
And the model minority myth hurts Asian people too. If an Asian American student is struggling in school, many teachers assume that they don't really need extra help. And it's not true that all Asians are crazy rich and successful. The poverty rate for Asian Americans is actually higher than the national average.
And frankly, it's kind of ridiculous that we lump people from so many different backgrounds together as Asian.
Yeah, Asian people are not a monolith. Trey, you and your multi-ethnic adopted parents keep referring to me as your smart Asian neighbor. Specifically, I am Korean American, and sure, I'm smart, but I also love Ultimate Frisbee. Why doesn't anybody talk about that?
You know what this is, mister? Computer's a person who contains multitudes and probably has a real name. You know what, Uncle Sammy? This is all your fault. Get out of my room.
Whoa, watch the hair.
Okay. So we can see how these stereotypes are still used today to help limit economic mobility of other minorities as well. And yes, the statistics hold that Asian Americans are more educated and driven, according to your textbook, but are still underrepresented in politics and in management positions in their fields. Here's a piece, we're not going to watch it, from the Patriot Act that talks about Asian American voting. You guys are welcome to watch it. We might discuss it another day, but it's here for you guys if you want to watch it on your own time. So different political successes for Asian Americans. There are currently 15 Asian Americans in Congress from a variety of backgrounds. Asian, Indian, Asian, Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese backgrounds. We have 3 Asian American senators, Mazi Hirono from Hawaii, Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, and Kamala Harris from California. She is Indian and African American, if you're wondering why she's listed on 2 separate groups. And then we still have these kind of stereotypes that are used today. Andrew Yang, who's running for president right now, is using that he is an Asian man who's good at math versus President Trump, continuing these kind of model minority stereotypes that are positive to help him win the White House. But at the same time, there is an Asian candidate for president, which doesn't normally happen. So you can see here, in the southern part of the United States is where a majority of minorities live, being mainly Hispanic and African American in the South, and Hispanic in the Southwest. No real surprise there that there's not a lot of minorities in the North. So other groups that have disparities in civil rights issues in the United States are LGBTIA community. They were formerly barred from serving in the military openly and have no protections on employment in most states. Military one no longer exists. There are still states that you can be fired for being gay. There are more protections for transgendered individuals. There's been a rapid swing in approval of gay marriage over the last 2 decades, especially among younger adults. Massachusetts was the first state to allow gay marriage. And then in 2015, we have Obergefell versus Hodges that expanded gay marriage to all Americans. Or I say gay marriage, expanding the right of same-sex marriage to all Americans. Political successes for LGBTIA individuals. We have 7 openly LGBTIA members in the House. We used to have 8. Katie Hill had to resign in November for a large scandal that, if you want to do some research on, it's fascinating and depressing at the same time. And then we have 2 openly LGBTIA senators, Tammy Baldwin, Wisconsin, who is openly gay, and Kristen Sinema from Arizona is openly bisexual. And then we have Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who's also running for president, who's the first major openly gay candidate for president. I had to look this up. Apparently there was a gay candidate running for Republican primary in 2012 that I had never heard of. So I'm going to call Mayor Pete the first major openly gay candidate, because he's the first candidate that has can have actual success running for president. So we've seen changes in opinion on same-sex marriage over the last 3 decades nearly, with it being at around 30% in '97, and in 2015 when it was passed, or when it was not ratified, it was held up by the Supreme Court. 60% of the country approved of same-sex marriage. So there are other disadvantaged groups as well. Civil Rights Act only looks at women and minorities, and other disadvantaged groups have had to gain civil rights from other legislation. Older Americans have employment disadvantages, so there's age discrimination laws put in place to protect the hiring of older citizens. And then we have disabled Americans have different measures for handicapped individuals, most importantly the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So just like when we talked about civil liberties, Americans have high ideals that clash with the reality of our society. There's still a struggle trying to combat America's original sin and discrimination in the United States that need to take place. And Abraham Lincoln called the United States a nation dedicated to the proportion that all men are created equal, which is still a strive in American culture today. So that is it. Do not forget to do your Chapter 5 quiz as well as your Chapter 4 quiz. Remember to watch the last week's night videos that are put up if you don't watch them in class. Those videos are up for being on your exam in the future. So I will see you on Chapter 6.